Substance abuse. We have a model to describe substance use and major depressive episode, MDE, for the sample space of American youth ages 12 to 17 in the US in 2018. That model is based on the information in the figure, and we are told that the figure represents substance use among those youth. And you can see in the vertical axis that the height of the columns represents the percent using. So substance use, what percent are using. And we can see there are a number of different substances listed: illicit drugs, marijuana, opioids, etc. We are also told that the information is, by past year major depressive episode, MDE status. And we have in blue had MDE, and in gray did not have MDE. So that means that substance use will be broken down by whether the person had a major depressive episode or not in the past year. So to make sure we understand, the first thing is we should focus, for instance, on the first column with a height of 32.7. So we know it's a percent. It's the percent using what? Illegal drugs within the past year. This is for the blue column, so for the category had a major depressive episode. So this tells us that 32.7 is the percent using illicit drugs among youth who had a major depressive episode. The next column is 14%, and that tells us that 14% of the youth who did not have a major depressive episode were using illicit drugs in the past year. So in probability notation, the first column is what is the probability of using illicit drugs, so P of illicit drug, when we only look at youth who had an MD, so given MD. And the next gray column, that's the probability of illicit drugs given no MD. So we want to make sure that our interpretation is consistent with the rest of the information and with each other. So notice that for the first two columns in blue and gray, we have a 32.7% and a 14%. Those do not add up to 100%, right? And that is consistent with examining the percent use of illicit drugs among two entirely different groups. So each group is its own. Both of those columns could be 100%. Both of those columns could be 0%. If you had thought that the figure represented the inverse conditional, so what is the probability of having versus not having MD, given that the youth used illicit drugs in the past year, then the blue and the gray column should add up to 100%, because either they did or they didn't have an MDE, so those two would be complementary. This is not the case here, because clearly, again, we are measuring what is the probability of using illicit drugs for two entirely different groups of individuals. The graph represents the probability of using a number of different substances. So therefore, again, the blue columns do not have to add up to anything. Each substance is examined separately, entirely on its own. Now that we fully understand all the elements of this figure, what do we learn from it? Well, we see that some substances have a higher percent of individuals using them than others. Obviously, illicit drugs overall, because that includes several of the substances described in the graph. But otherwise, most notably, the percent of youth using marijuana in the past year was the highest of all the different types of substances. And that was true both for individuals with an MD and individuals without an MD. On the other end, we see that the probability of using opioids and the probability of using cigarettes are actually fairly similar. Also, most obviously, when comparing youth with an MD and youth without an MD, so the blue and the gray columns, we see that for every type of substance examined, the blue column is taller than the corresponding gray column. So that tells us that the probability of using each of those substances is higher among those with an MD than among those without an MD. So that tells us there is a clear pattern of association between MD status and substance use among youth in the US in 2018. Can we conclude that it's a cause and effect? Not at all. Maybe one of these is a contributing factor to the other, or maybe something else, like an environmental or genetic factor, could be actually influencing both of those attributes. So again, very clear pattern of association, and we can make that as a statement of fact. It's undeniable. What we cannot say is why this association exists.